"Gather your belongings, sweetheart," Della Hartwell said, her voice carrying the particular sweetness of someone who had practiced cruelty until it sounded like concern loud enough for every passenger in the first-class cabin to hear every single syllable. Passengers holding discounted economy tickets cannot self-upgrade. I'm going to need you to collect your things and move to the back of the aircraft, or I will have no choice but to have security escort you off this plane entirely. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward seat 4A. Naomi Carter did not flinch. She did not look up immediately, did not grip the armrest, did not do any of the things a person does when the ground shifts beneath them without warning. She simply reached forward with the unhurried calm of someone who has all the time in the world and marked her page in her novel a small, deliberate act that somehow managed to be the loudest thing in the cabin. Then she looked up at Della, and the look she gave was not anger, was not fear, was not the wounded expression Della had clearly been expecting and perhaps hoping for. It was something far more unsettling than any of those things. It was the expression of a woman who was quietly, methodically, and with absolute certainty committing everything she was witnessing to memory. Naomi said nothing yet. She only looked. And Della, who had spent 22 years learning how to read a cabin, felt something she could not immediately name move through her chest like a cold draft through a cracked window there and gone before she could catch it. 2 hours earlier, Naomi Carter had moved through John F. Kennedy International Airport's Terminal 4. The way water moves through a crowded room quietly without announcement, finding the path of least resistance. Not because she was weak, but because she had learned long ago that the most effective kind of power rarely announces itself at the door. Terminal 4 smelled the way all major airports smell at 6 in the evening. Stale coffee going cold in paper cups. The sharp synthetic bite of hand sanitizer dispensers positioned every 20 feet. The faintly metallic undertone of recycled air and collective human anxiety, and underneath all of it just barely detectable if you knew what you were smelling for the distant ghost of aviation fuel seeping in through every crack and seal in the building. Naomi knew that smell better than almost anyone in that terminal. She had grown up breathing it. At 42 years old, Naomi Carter was the newly appointed Chief Operations Officer of Vanguard Aviation, the multi-billion-dollar parent conglomerate that had finalized a hostile takeover of transatlantic airlines just 8 days prior. It was a title that came with a corner office on the 42nd floor of Vanguard's Chicago headquarters. A security detail she consistently declined, and the authority to restructure an entire airline from the ground up if she decided the situation called for it. The situation she was increasingly certain called for it. But tonight, nobody in Terminal 4 knew any of that. Nobody was supposed to. She wore a simple camel cashmere sweater that had been washed enough times to lose its newness. Tailored black slacks and a pair of leather loafers worn soft and comfortable at the heels. Her natural hair was pulled back into a neat, unassuming bun. She carried no designer handbag, no status symbol luggage, no visible marker of the professional world she occupied when she was not deliberately making herself invisible. Just a battered leather briefcase, its edges softened by years of use, holding inside it a classified operational dossier that represented months of careful, meticulous preparation. The audit had been her idea. Vanguard's board had received 47 formal complaints in the past 18 months. 47 documented, signed, submitted through proper channels, complaints about passenger profiling and staff hostility in transatlantic's premium cabins, with a particular and troubling concentration of those complaints coming from passengers who did not look like the airline's imagined ideal customer. 47 complaints that had collectively resulted in 4 internal reviews, 3 written warnings, and 0 meaningful change. Naomi had read every single one of those complaints in a single sitting on a Tuesday evening in her office, with the city lights of Chicago spreading out beneath her. And by the time she reached the 47th, she had already made her decision. She was not going to send another auditor. She was not going to commission another report. She was going to go herself unannounced, dressed like anyone, and she was going to see what 47 people had tried to tell the airline, and the airline had chosen not to hear. She had started her career 20 years ago as a ramp agent at a mid-sized regional airport in Georgia, hauling luggage in summer heat that made the tarmac shimmer like water, learning the mechanical and human grammar of aviation from the ground up in the most literal sense possible. She knew what this industry looked like from every altitude. She knew exactly what she was walking into tonight. She had simply decided that it was time for the airline to find out what it had been doing wrong and, more importantly, who was going to be the one to fix it. The gate agent, a young man named Timothy with an easy smile and a tendency to make genuine eye contact with passengers, scanned her digital boarding pass with practiced efficiency. The screen blinked green. A pleasant chime followed. "Welcome aboard, Miss Brooks. Miss Carter. Seat 4A. Have a wonderful flight." Timothy smiled, completely unaware that he had just waved through his ultimate boss. The jet bridge smelled of aviation fuel and climate-controlled air, and the faint, rubbery staleness of the accordion tunnel itself. And Naomi's footsteps were quiet on the industrial carpet as she walked the slight downward slope toward the aircraft door, the way she had walked 1,000 jet bridges before this one, though usually from the other direction and in considerably different attire. Della Hartwell was stationed at the aircraft door the way a sentry is stationed at a gate, not merely standing there, but occupying the space, owning it, radiating the particular authority of someone who has commanded this specific threshold for long enough that she no longer thinks of it as the airline's doorway, but as her own. She was a woman in her late 50s, with platinum blonde hair pulled back into a flawless professional chignon red lipstick, applied with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was a form of power. A uniform so perfectly pressed it looked almost architectural, and shoes buffed to a mirror shine. The small gold star on her name badge indicated over 22 years of service with Transatlantic Airlines, and she wore it the way some people wear a rank insignia, not as a symbol of dedication, but as a statement of hierarchy. She greeted the passenger ahead of Naomi with a warm, practiced smile that reached her eyes with convincing authenticity. Then Naomi stepped through the door, and Della's eyes moved over her the way a customs officer's eyes move over luggage, quickly, efficiently sorting and categorizing. And the smile did not disappear so much as it recalibrated, cooling by several precise degrees, the warmth draining out of it like water from a shallow dish, leaving behind something that looked like a smile, in the same way that a copy looks like an original. Della shifted her weight slightly, a subtle sideways step that brought her body closer to the center of the aisle, leading toward the first-class cabin. Not a full block. Not anything you could point to and call deliberate, but enough to communicate without words that this direction required a reason. Naomi held up her phone. The digital boarding pass was clear: her name, the flight number, the seat assignment. 4A, first class. Della looked at the screen for a moment longer than was necessary, and then, without apology, without acknowledgement of what she had just done, said only, "Down to the left. Stow your bag quickly, please. We have other passengers boarding," and turned away. Naomi filed the moment away without expression, profiling at the door before she had spoken a word, before she had done anything except exist in this space. Strike one. She made her way into the first-class cabin, polished wood grain surfaces, soft amber lighting. Wide, lie-flat leather seats, breathing quiet luxury, and settled into 4A, a window seat at the bulkhead, pulling out her novel and opening it to a page she had no real intention of reading, because what she was actually doing was watching. It was in that moment, as she adjusted her position and let her gaze drift naturally down the length of the cabin, that she noticed the boy in seat 6A. He was about 9 years old, settled into the wide first-class seat with the slightly comical look of a child who finds himself in a chair clearly designed for someone 3 times his size, and he was working with tremendous concentration on a coloring book. His tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth in the particular expression of a person for whom the line between the dragon's wing and the page border is a matter of serious artistic principle. He had a small backpack shaped like a cartoon bear tucked under the seat in front of him, and beside him sat a man in his 30s. His father, clearly the same eyes who was reviewing documents on a tablet, with the distracted focus of someone trying to work while remaining aware that a 9-year-old is operating nearby. As Naomi passed, the boy looked up from his coloring book. He looked directly at her with the uncomplicated, unfiltered openness that children deploy before the world teaches them to be more careful with their attention. And he smiled. Not a polite smile, not a performed smile, just a real one, the kind that means nothing except that a person is glad another person exists in their vicinity. Naomi smiled back. It was the first time since she had walked into Terminal 4 that something in her chest loosened even slightly. She settled into 4A, opened her novel, and waited to see what the next few hours would teach her. The first-class cabin filled with the particular efficiency of a high-demand international flight, departing on schedule, overhead bins clicking shut, the soft sound of champagne being poured, the low murmur of people arranging themselves and their belongings into the temporary geography of a 7-hour journey. Hedge fund managers in suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent, a couple in their 60s, wearing matching linen, and the relaxed expressions of people for whom first class is not an occasion but a habit. A young woman in 5A who had already set up a ring light on her tray table and appeared to be editing footage on a professional-grade laptop. Della moved through it all with the fluid authority of a conductor at the podium distributing pre-departure champagne, accepting coats for hanging, addressing passengers by names she had clearly memorized from the manifest, except that when she reached Naomi, she did not address her by name, did not offer champagne, did not ask about coat hanging. She moved past with the smooth efficiency of someone executing a decision they had already made. Raymond Voss arrived 9 minutes before the boarding door closed. He was a man in his mid-60s who had been large in every sense for long enough that he seemed to genuinely believe the world organized itself around his dimensions. Broad shoulders inside a 3-piece bespoke suit in a shade of deep charcoal. A face permanently flushed with the particular high color of a man who eats richly, drinks freely, and sleeps soundly, in the knowledge that he has never once had to wait for anything he truly wanted. He came down the aisle with a pre-departure champagne already in hand. Della had handed it to him the moment he stepped through the aircraft door before he had found his seat. Before he had even fully boarded a small offering of recognition that he accepted without acknowledgement the way a man accepts what he considers his due. He stopped at row 4. He looked at seat 4. B, his seat, and then he looked at 4A, and the expression that crossed his face was not surprise. It was something closer to offense, the way a person looks when they reach for something in a familiar place and find it unexpectedly occupied. He looked at Naomi for a long moment, taking in the cashmere sweater, the worn briefcase tucked in the overhead bin, the natural hair, the absence of the visual signals he associated with legitimacy in this particular space, and then he spoke at a volume that was not accidental. "Excuse me," Raymond said, and the 2 words contained an entire argument. "I think there may have been some confusion about this row." Naomi looked up from her book with the measured patience of someone who had been expecting this or something very much like it. "I don't believe so," she said pleasantly. "This is 4A. Is there something I can help you with?" "I always sit in row 4, Raymond said, as if this were a documented fact with legal standing. 4B is my seat. 4A was marked as reserved, a VIP booking they told me at the gate." He paused, and the pause was the sharpest thing he had said yet. "You don't look like a VIP. Are you certain you haven't made a mistake? The main cabin is back through the curtain." Naomi looked at him with an expression of such perfect, pleasant neutrality that it was impossible to tell what was happening behind it. "I am entirely certain," she said. "I am in the correct seat. I hope you enjoy your flight, sir." She returned to her book. Raymond's jaw tightened with the barely contained frustration of a man who has not been dismissed in a very long time and does not know what to do with the sensation. He turned down the aisle, raised one hand, and snapped his fingers. In 6A. Oliver looked up from his coloring book at the sound, stared at Raymond with the frank, unself-conscious assessment of a child, and then looked at his father with an expression that said plainly what is wrong with that man. His father put a quiet hand on Oliver's shoulder and said nothing. Della appeared from the front galley with the speed of someone who had been watching and waiting, crossing the distance between the galley curtain and row 4 and 6 purposeful steps, her face reorganizing itself into an expression of warm, solicitous concern that was directed entirely and exclusively at Raymond. "Mr. Voss," she said with the warmth she had not offered Naomi. "What can I do for you? Is there anything you need?" Raymond leaned in his voice, dropping in volume but not in conviction, and explained the situation, his reading of it anyway, gesturing toward Naomi with the blunt instrument of a hand accustomed to pointing at things it once moved. Della listened, and the listening itself was a performance, her head tilting slightly, her brow contracting with sympathetic concern, her eyes moving once to Naomi, and then quickly back to Raymond, as though the sight of Naomi in that seat was itself a kind of answer. Then Della turned to face Naomi, and when she spoke, her voice had that particular quality, pitched just a few decibels above what the conversation required, shaped by long practice to carry through a cabin without appearing to shout. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to present your boarding pass again," Della said, extending her hand with the expectant authority of someone who has never been refused. "We need to verify your seat assignment." Naomi placed her novel face down on the tray table, reached into her pocket with a composure so complete it seemed almost architectural, and held up her phone. The boarding pass filled the screen. Her name, the flight number, seat 4A, first class, purchased at full fare through the executive ticketing system. Della looked at the screen. Something moved across her face, a flicker of something that might have been recalibration, and then it was gone, swallowed by the momentum of a decision already in motion. "The app has been having issues on this route," Della said, and the lie came out smoothly practiced, sounding like a sentence that had been waiting for the right moment. "I can't accept a digital pass. I can't verify. I'll need to see a paper ticket." "There is no paper ticket requirement," Naomi said, and her voice had acquired, without rising in volume, even fractionally, a new quality, precise, clear, carrying the weight of someone who is not speculating, but stating fact. "Digital boarding passes have been universally accepted by this airline and by the TSA for 3 years. The gate agent scanned this pass 15 minutes ago. It is valid." "Are you calling me a liar?" Della's voice spiked, the professional veneer cracking along its edges. "I am telling you what the operations manual says," Naomi replied without heat. Section 4, paragraph 12. A passenger's assigned seat cannot be revoked once they have boarded unless they represent a direct safety threat, are intoxicated, or at the explicit direction of the captain in an emergency situation. Sitting next to Mr. Voss does not qualify as any of those things. From row 5, a woman named Priya, who had been watching everything from behind the thin pretense of scrolling her phone, quietly opened her camera app. She angled the lens with the careful patience of someone who understands that what she is witnessing matters, and began to record. Della's face had moved past professional authority and into something rawer and harder. The expression of a person who has built their understanding of a situation on a foundation that is now visibly cracking, and who is responding not by questioning the foundation, but by pressing harder on it. "You are being disruptive," Della announced, her voice carrying now with unmistakable intention, projecting the narrative outward to the entire cabin before anyone could offer a competing version of events. "You are refusing a direct instruction from a senior crew member, which is a federal offense. I am giving you one final opportunity to collect your belongings and relocate to seat 48E in the economy cabin, where I will have the gate agent sort out your ticketing situation once we have landed in London." She paused, letting the next sentence arrive with the full weight of finality. If you refuse, I will summon Port Authority police to remove you from this aircraft." The threat settled over the cabin like a change in air pressure, something everyone felt but no one immediately named. In row 3, a man in a good suit pressed the call button with the vaguely helpless expression of someone who wanted to do something and could not decide what. In row 7, a woman with silver hair and shaking hands gripped her phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. Most people looked at their tray tables or their windows. Naomi looked at Della. The look lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and it was utterly profoundly calm, the calm of deep water of something with weight and depth beneath it, untroubled by the surface activity above. "I am not moving to seat 48, Naomi said, and the words came out level and clear, and impossibly unhurried, each one placed with the deliberate care of a person who understands that what they are saying will matter later. I am not leaving this seat, and if you attempt to remove me—" "Della, I want to be very precise about this. It will be the most consequential professional decision you have ever made. Not a threat, a guarantee." Della stared at her for one long, unsteady moment and then turned and walked to the galley with the rapid, stiff-legged stride of someone who has already decided on a course of action and is running out of time to execute it before doubt catches up. Priya's camera was still running. And if you've ever watched someone refuse to be broken, if you've ever seen a person hold their ground when the entire room was asking them to give it up, then you know why stories like this one matter and why we need you to subscribe to our channel, because this is only the beginning of what happens next. The sound of the galley curtain being yanked shut. The hard plastic rings snapping against the metal rail in a sharp percussive line was followed almost immediately by the lower, more urgent sound of voices behind the thin fabric barrier. A conversation that was not quite quiet enough to be private. Jade, the junior flight attendant, had been standing at the edge of the galley for the past 4 minutes with the particular physical stillness of someone who very much wants to say something and is trying to calculate whether they are allowed to. She was 26 in her second year with Transatlantic, and she had been watching the situation in row 4 with the growing, sickening certainty of someone watching a car accelerate towards something that hasn't moved out of the way yet. Della Jade said, her voice careful, calibrated to be heard without being overheard. "The manifest tablet. I checked it twice. 4A is Naomi Carter." The pass scanned green at the gate. "I saw it come through on the system. Everything checks out." "The system is wrong," Della said, and she was already reaching for the heavy red interphone handset on the galley wall. Her movements rapid and purposeful with the energy of someone who is committed to a direction and is not going to allow second thoughts to slow her down. "She's aggressive. She threatened me. I'm not managing this woman across the Atlantic when I don't know who she is or how she got into that seat. But if she's legitimately Jade—" Della's voice dropped to a register that was harder and colder than anything she had used in the cabin. "Do not finish that sentence." Jade stepped back. She pressed her lips together. She looked through the narrow gap in the curtain at Naomi sitting quietly in 4A, with her hands resting in her lap. And then she looked back at Della, who was already pressing the interphone button for the flight deck. The transformation in Della's voice when Captain Douglas Reed picked up was immediate and total. The cold authority evaporating, replaced by a breathless, slightly trembling register that was a different kind of performance. The performance of someone who needs to be believed quickly and has found the tone that usually works. Captain Reed Della said, "This is Della at the forward galley. I have a serious situation in first class. I have a passenger in seat 4A who is presenting what appears to be a fraudulent digital boarding pass. When I asked her to relocate so we could verify her status, she became combative and threatening. She explicitly threatened me, Captain. She said removing her would be the worst decision of my career, and she is now refusing to leave the aircraft. I need Port Authority police to board immediately. She is a danger to this flight." There was a pause. The sound of Captain Reed's voice came through the earpiece, and Della's expression shifted slightly. A question being asked that she had not anticipated. Carter, Della said. Naomi Carter, seat 4A. Another pause, longer this time. Yes, I'll wait, Della said, and something in her voice had gone slightly uncertain, though she would not have been able to say why. Della stepped out from the galley with the composed triumph of someone who has set a mechanism in motion and is waiting for it to produce the predetermined result, smoothing the front of her uniform skirt as she moved into the aisle and announced to the cabin that Port Authority police were on their way, that Naomi had approximately 3 minutes to leave voluntarily before the situation became something she would find considerably more unpleasant. Several passengers exhaled audibly. A man in row 3 muttered something under his breath about delays. A woman 2 rows behind him said more clearly, "Just comply. We all have places to be." The social pressure of a full cabin settled onto the situation like weather diffuse environmental. The kind of pressure that doesn't come from anywhere specific, but that you feel on every surface of yourself simultaneously. Naomi sat exactly as she had been sitting. Her hands were in her lap. Her breathing was steady. Her eyes moved to the window to the dark tarmac of JFK spread out below the terminal lights, and she held them there with the focused stillness of someone who is looking at one thing but thinking about another, thinking if anyone had been able to read her expression precisely about a number. 47. The 47 complaints that had come before this moment from 47 people who had sat in seats like this one and been made to feel that their presence required justification, and who had not had what Naomi had tonight: a title, a legal team, a corner office, the ability to make this stop. She thought about those 47 people and felt the weight of the evening settle differently on her shoulders, heavier and more purposeful than before. In seat 6, Oliver had stopped coloring entirely. He was sitting forward slightly, his small hands resting on his coloring book, without pressing down, his eyes moving between Della standing sentry at the front of the aisle with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and Naomi, who was looking out the window. His face wore the expression that children's faces wear when they are trying to make sense of something the adult world has presented to them without warning. Not frightened, not confused exactly, but deeply, seriously attentive, working something out. He turned to his father and said in a voice that was quiet but not quiet enough to be contained to Roe, "Six, Dad, why does that lady have to leave?" "She didn't do anything wrong." His father, a man named David who worked in urban planning and had spent the past 20 minutes trying to decide whether to say something, and concluding each time that he did not know what to say, put his hand on Oliver's shoulder and said quietly, "I don't know, Bud." Oliver looked back at Naomi. His forehead was slightly creased with the effort of sustained moral processing. He did not look away. Priya in 5A had shifted her phone's angle slightly, and the frame of her video now included both Naomi's profile at the window and Oliver's face in the row behind a 9-year-old boy watching a woman be told she did not belong, trying to understand why and failing to find a reason. Della stood at the head of the aisle. Her fingers beneath the crossed arms were not entirely still. The boots were audible before the officers were visible, a heavy, purposeful rhythm on the jet bridge floor that announced its own authority, and then 2 Port Authority officers in tactical gear stepped through the aircraft door and into the first-class cabin with the compressed, ready energy of people who have been told this is a Code 3 situation and are prepared to treat it accordingly. "Which passenger is the disturbance?" the lead officer asked, his voice filling the cabin with practiced command. Della pointed with the decisive gesture of someone who has been waiting to make exactly this gesture at seat 4A. "Right there, officer." Fraudulent boarding pass, refused crew instructions directly threatened my safety. She needs to be removed immediately. The 2 officers moved down the aisle with the efficiency of people executing a clear mandate. Stopping at row 4, the lead officer looking down at Naomi with the assessment of someone who has arrived mid-story and is reading the room as fast as he can. "Ma'am," he said, "I need you to gather your belongings and come with us right now." Naomi looked up at him, The look was calm, direct, and without performance. "Officer," she said, her voice steady and unhurried. "I want to strongly recommend that you confirm the passenger manifest with the flight deck before you take any further action. This crew member has filed a false report. I am not a threat to this aircraft. I am a legitimately boarded passenger in my legitimately assigned seat, and I am telling you as clearly as I am able to that the person who called you up here lied to you." The second officer reached toward Naomi's arm. And then the cockpit door opened. The sound it made was not dramatic, a solid mechanical click and swing. The ordinary sound of a reinforced door moving on professional-grade hinges, but in the context of the silence that had gathered in the first-class cabin over the past several minutes, it landed like a thunderclap. Captain Douglas Reed stepped out. He was a tall man, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, wearing 4 gold stripes on his epaulets that represented 31 years of accumulated authority in the air, and he moved into the cabin aisle with the unhurried decisiveness of someone who has assessed a situation from a distance and arrived at a conclusion he does not intend to revisit. He did not look at the officers. He did not look at Della, though he passed within 2 feet of her and she said his name, her voice rising with sudden, urgent expectation. He did not look at Raymond Voss, who had been watching the proceedings from 4B, with the complicated expression of a man who is beginning to understand that the story is not going where he expected. Captain Reed looked at seat 4A. He crossed the distance to it in 4 steps. He stopped. He brought his feet together, a small, precise gesture that registered as formal in a way that nothing else in the cabin had been, and he clasped his hands in front of him and inclined his head in a nod of such clear, unmistakable respect that every person watching it felt the meaning before they had time to process the words. "Ma'am," Captain Reed said, and his voice was quiet, and it was the most important word spoken in the first-class cabin of Flight 219 since the boarding door had been sealed. "I am so profoundly sorry. I received the updated VIP manifest on my secure tablet approximately 3 minutes ago, and He paused, and the pause had the weight of a man choosing very carefully exactly what to say next. "I am deeply sorry for whatever has happened here tonight. Is there anything you need?" The silence that followed was the kind that changes the air in a room. Della's hand, which had been extended toward Captain Reed's arm as he passed her, dropped slowly to her side. Her face, for the first time in this entire sequence of events, had gone completely still, not with composure, but with the particular stillness of someone who has just understood what they have done and cannot yet find the path forward from that understanding. In seat 6, Oliver watched Captain Reed bow his head to the woman everyone had been trying to make leave, and the crease in his forehead smoothed out, and he picked up his coloring pencil again slowly, as if something that had been disordered had been set right. There is a particular quality to the way certain people rise from a chair. Not the physical mechanics of it, which are the same for everyone, but something in the intention behind the movement, the way some people stand up and the room simply continues, and other people stand up and something in the atmosphere quietly but irreversibly shifts. Naomi Carter stood up from seat 4A, and the first-class cabin of Flight 219 felt it the way a room feels a change in pressure before a storm. She was the same woman who had boarded in a worn cashmere sweater and a battered leather briefcase. The sweater had not changed. The briefcase was still in the overhead bin. But the woman who stood now in the aisle of the Boeing 777 occupied space differently than she had when she was sitting, not taller, not louder, not more decorated with the usual markers of power, just somehow more completely and unmistakably herself, the way a word you have been mispronouncing your whole life sounds when you finally hear it correctly pronounced. She looked at the officers first. "Gentlemen," she said, with a warmth toward them that contained no trace of the condescension she had received for the past 40 minutes. "I owe you an apology for the waste of your time and professional resources tonight, and I want you to know that the airline takes full responsibility for that. My name is Naomi Carter. I am the Chief Operations Officer of Vanguard Aviation, the parent company that completed its acquisition of Transatlantic Airlines 8 days ago. She held up her phone. Not the boarding pass this time, but a different screen. A corporate credentials page with her photograph and her title in clear, unambiguous text. The boarding pass on my phone is not fraudulent. It was issued through the executive ticketing system. I am not a threat to this crew. I am, in point of fact, the person who signs their paychecks. The lead officer looked at the screen. He looked at Captain Reed, who nodded once without hesitation. The officer exhaled a long, measured breath and nodded. "Understood, ma'am. We'll get out of your way." One more thing, Naomi said before they turned. Vanguard Aviation will be making a formal contribution to the Port Authority Widows and Children's Fund by end of business tomorrow. An apology is not enough for what your time was used for tonight, but it is a start. The officers left. Their boots on the jet bridge grew quieter and then disappeared entirely, and the first-class cabin was left with what they had left behind, the fact of what had just been witnessed and what it meant, and the faces of the people who had been watching. Priya's phone was still recording. Raymond Voss in 4B had said nothing for the past 4 minutes, which was the longest he had gone without speaking since boarding, and his face had the particular pale quality of a man who has just heard a name, Vanguard Aviation, and is doing rapid, silent arithmetic about what it means for him personally. Naomi turned to Della. The cabin went quieter than it had been at any point in the evening, the kind of silence that has texture that you can feel against your skin, that means everyone has simultaneously decided to stop moving and simply witness what is about to happen. Della's composure had been dismantling itself in stages over the past several minutes. First the certainty, then the confidence, then the authority, and now what remained was something smaller and more human, and in a strange way more honest than anything she had shown during the preceding 40 minutes. A woman who has done something she cannot undo, and has arrived at the moment of understanding exactly what that means. "Strike one," Naomi said, and her voice had no anger in it. Something more difficult to receive than anger. Something that was simply clarity, the way a well-made knife is simply itself. "You stopped me at the boarding door. You did not check my boarding pass. You looked at me, my clothes, my bag, my skin, and made a determination about where I belonged before I had done a single thing to inform that determination. That is profiling. That is a violation of this airline's passenger rights policy and of basic human decency." Della opened her mouth. Naomi raised one finger, not aggressive, barely a gesture at all, but it was enough. "Strike two. When Mr. Voss demanded my removal without a single verifiable reason, you did not consult the manifest. You did not verify the ticketing system. You invented a defect in the boarding app that does not exist, and you used that invention to build a case against a passenger whose pass had already been confirmed valid at the gate. You lied. In front of a cabin full of witnesses." She paused, and in the pause the air in the cabin was very still. "Strike three. You reported to your captain that I had a fraudulent boarding pass, that I had threatened your physical safety, and that I was a danger to this flight. All three of those statements were false. You directed federal law enforcement officers to remove a legitimately seated passenger based on lies you constructed because she did not look the way you decided a first-class passenger should look." She looked at Della for one long, level moment. "You are suspended from duty effective immediately pending a formal termination hearing. Captain Reed will escort you off this aircraft. Your union representative will be notified." Della's voice, when she found it, was barely recognizable as the same voice that had commanded the cabin 20 minutes earlier, stripped of its authority, thin and unsteady, the voice of someone standing in the wreckage of a decision they cannot take back. 22 years, she said. I've given 22 years to this airline. Please, please don't do this." Naomi looked at her, and the look was not without feeling. It was in fact exactly because of feeling that it was so unflinching. "If I had been anyone else tonight," she said quietly, "if I had been a teacher, a student, a young mother, anyone without what I have, you would have had me arrested. You would have put handcuffs on a woman who had done nothing wrong, and you would have gone home tonight and slept. That is the thing I need you to understand, Della. This was not a mistake. Mistakes are accidents. This was a choice made again and again at every point tonight when you could have chosen differently." Captain Reed stepped forward. His expression was grave and certain. "Della, come with me." Della looked around the cabin one last time at the passengers who had murmured their agreement with her not 20 minutes ago, and who were now looking at her with something between pity and a reckoning of their own. And then she turned and walked into the galley, and the curtain fell behind her, and she did not come back. Naomi turned to Jade, who was standing very still at the edge of the galley entrance, her eyes bright with something that was not quite tears, and not quite relief, but was close to both. "Jade." Naomi said gently, "You're the acting senior purser for this flight. Please close the boarding door, and let's get these people to London." The energy in the cabin after Della's departure had the strange, disoriented quality of a room after a storm has passed. Not calm exactly, but quiet in a way that felt earned, rather than merely present, the quiet of people who have witnessed something they are still processing and have not yet found the words for. Naomi turned to Raymond Voss. It was the first time she had looked at him directly, and without deflection since he had first addressed her, and the directness of it, the simple unperformed act of turning and meeting his eyes, seemed to do something to him physically. A slight shrinking, a realignment of his posture that was not voluntary. "Mr. Voss," she said. There was no particular inflection in the words. She did not need inflection. Raymond opened his hands in a gesture of conciliation, broad palm, out the body language of a man who has decided that cheerful reasonableness might still be available to him as a strategy. "Look," he said, and he even managed something approximating a chuckle, the kind of sound men like Raymond produce when they want to signal that the preceding events were merely a misunderstanding between equals that sensible adults can move past without further fuss. "This has been a wild few minutes, I'll give you that. Clearly there's been a miscommunication all the way around. Tempers got a little high. These things happen on long flights." He tilted his head in a way that suggested he was offering her something generous. "Let me buy you a drink when we reach cruising altitude. No hard feelings." Naomi looked at him without expression for long enough that the offer finished existing in the air between them and simply dissolved. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me when you first stood at this row?" Raymond's eyes shifted slightly, the eyes of a man accessing memory and simultaneously calculating risk. "I was speaking in the heat of, you said I didn't look like a V. P," Naomi said. "And then you told me the main cabin was back through the curtain." She paused. "And when you thought I was about to be arrested, you didn't say a single word." You sat back and watched. The chuckle was gone. Raymond's hands had come down from their conciliatory position and settled in his lap. "Your apology is noted," Naomi said, "and it is not accepted. Not because I am unwilling to forgive, but because an apology delivered at the precise moment consequences arrive is not an expression of regret. It is a negotiation tactic, and I want to be honest with you about the fact that I can see the difference." She straightened slightly, and the movement itself was a kind of sentence. "Your Platinum Elite status with Transatlantic Airlines is revoked effective immediately. You will be reclassified as a basic economy passenger across all Vanguard-owned carriers and our alliance partners for a minimum of 5 years. And tonight, Mr. Voss, you will be relocating to seat 48E in the economy cabin." She held his gaze. You have 10 seconds. Raymond's face went through several stages in rapid succession. Disbelief, outrage, the automatic reach toward the former. CEO's name as a shield. I know Gerald Whitmore personally. I've flown this route for 15. And then, when Naomi told him simply that Gerald Whitmore had been terminated the previous Thursday, as part of Vanguard's leadership restructuring the final stage deflation. The slow, undeniable understanding that the world he thought he was operating in had already changed, and he had simply not been informed. He stood. He pulled his suit jacket from the overhead bin with the movements of someone who is very carefully not looking at anyone. He picked up his briefcase, and then he walked down the aisle of the first-class cabin past row 5, where Priya tracked him with her camera, past row 6, where Oliver watched him go with the wide, direct attention of a child who is witnessing something he will remember, all the way to the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the aircraft, and through it and out of sight. In row 6, Elliot Harmon, CEO of Harmon Logistics, who had boarded quietly and said nothing during the entire sequence of events, who had a contract signing scheduled in London in 17 hours that represented the largest partnership deal of Raymond Voss's professional year, watched Raymond disappear through the curtain and took out his phone and began to compose an email. The first-class cabin of Flight 2219 had, by the time Naomi turned to face it fully, the slightly suspended quality of an audience at the end of a performance that has ended in a way they did not quite anticipate, alert, attentive, uncertain of the appropriate response. Naomi stood in the aisle and did not use the interphone, did not reach for a microphone. She simply spoke to the people in front of her, the way you speak to people when what you have to say is meant for them specifically, and not for anyone performing the role of listening. I want to apologize to all of you, she said. Not for anything I did tonight, but for the fact that you had to see it, that what happened here is something that happens in the cabins of this airline and has been happening, and that the people whose job it was to address it chose repeatedly and over a significant period of time not to. She paused, and in the pause the cabin was very quiet. What you witnessed tonight was not exceptional. It was not a one-time failure of one employee. It was the result of a culture that had been allowed to grow in the dark for a long time. A culture that decided some passengers need to prove they belong and others are simply assumed to. That changes tonight. Not because of what happened to me. I have the resources to protect myself, and I know that. And I am acutely aware that most of the people who have sat in seats like this one and been treated the way I was treated tonight did not have those resources. This changes tonight because of them. She looked around the cabin at the woman in row 3, who was crying quietly at the man in row 7, who was nodding slowly at the young woman in 5A, who had her recording phone pressed to her chest like she was holding something breakable. And then she looked at row 6, at Oliver, who was watching her with the particular quality of attention that children give to things they have decided are important, his coloring book forgotten in his lap. Every passenger on this flight will receive a full refund of their ticket fare, Naomi said. Not as silence, but as acknowledgement. You were here. You saw what was happening. Most of you said nothing, and I understand why, because it is profoundly uncomfortable to speak into a room when the power in that room seems to be arranged against you. I understand that. She paused. But some of you almost did, and that matters too. The applause, when it came, started in row 7 with the woman who had been shaking throughout the entire sequence of events and spread unevenly through the cabin. Not unanimous, not theatrical, just the genuine, somewhat awkward sound of people clapping because they mean it and are not sure if they are doing it right. Jade sealed the boarding door with both hands and the full weight of someone who understands the significance of the act. A thick, satisfying mechanical thud that meant this is closed, this is done. We are going now, and then turned back to the cabin with a steadiness in her face that had not been there when the evening began. The crew moved through the first-class cabin with a different quality of attention than they had managed while Della was present, not faster, not more efficient exactly, but more human, as if the removal of a particular kind of pressure had allowed them to remember that service is not performance, but presence. Jade brought Naomi a fresh cup of Earl Grey tea without being asked. Her hands were level. She set it down with care. "You're doing beautifully," Naomi said. Jade ducked her head briefly, the reflex of someone who is not yet fully accustomed to being seen. "Thank you, Miss Carter," she said. "We're honored." "Really?" She moved on to the next row, and her shoulders were straighter than they had been in hours. From row 6, a small hand appeared at the edge of Naomi's peripheral vision. First, and then Oliver was there, standing at the end of her row with his coloring book held out in front of him, with the slightly formal, utterly sincere offering of a child, presenting something he has decided is a gift. He had colored a Boeing 777 in blues and silvers across a full page, the sky around it filled with stars that had no astronomical basis but made perfect emotional sense. "I made it for you," Oliver said, "because you were the bravest person on the plane." Naomi took the drawing with both hands. She looked at it for a moment with the careful attention it deserved, and then she looked at Oliver, and it was the first time all evening that the smile on her face was entirely unguarded, entirely itself. The smile of a person not an executive, not a defendant, not a woman making a point, just a person receiving something honest from another person. "Thank you, Oliver," she said. "I'm going to keep this." Oliver nodded as if this was the correct and obvious answer and went back to row 6. His father, David, mouthed, "Sorry to bother you," in Naomi's direction. She shook her head slightly and held up the drawing, and David smiled and looked away at his window, and the moment folded itself into the fabric of the flight. Priya appeared at Naomi's shoulder a few minutes later, phone in hand. Expression somewhere between apologetic and resolute. "I should tell you," she said, "I was recording." "From the beginning." "I know," Naomi said. "I haven't posted anything. I wanted to ask you first." Priya paused. "I think people should see it, but I understand if you'd rather it didn't go out." Naomi was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the lights of JFK were receding the long, bright geometry of the runways and taxiways and terminal buildings, shrinking away into the dark below as the aircraft climbed and the city became a concept rather than a place. "Wait until we land," Naomi said finally. "Give the airline 24 hours to make a statement first. After that, it's yours to do with what you think is right." Priya nodded and went back to her seat, and the Boeing 777 climbed into the dark above the Atlantic, carrying 31 people and one very significant drawing of a plane rendered in blue and silver toward the morning rising over London. Seat 48E was the kind of seat that exists at the tail end of every long-haul aircraft, like a small, humbling joke told at the expense of whoever ends up in its center position in the last row before the aft bulkhead hemmed in on both sides by the window and aisle seats. The way a filling is hemmed in by bread close enough to the lavatory that the doors opening and closing produced a rhythmic chemical draft of blue sanitation fluid every 3 to 5 minutes with the mechanical reliability of a metronome. Raymond Voss lowered himself into it with the careful movements of a man whose 3-piece bespoke suit in deep charcoal had been designed for an environment roughly analogous to a private library-wide armchair's soft lighting, adequate air, and was now being asked to perform in conditions it had not been consulted about. His knees contacted the seat back in front of him before he was fully seated. He shifted. They contacted it again. He adjusted his jacket, which bunched uncomfortably at the shoulders, and refused to settle the fabric, simply not equipped to negotiate a 17-inch seat width with any dignity. To his left, a university student wearing headphones the size of small speakers from which a steady percussion of bass frequencies leaked into the surrounding air with the democratic generosity of sound that has decided it belongs to everyone. The student had the window seat slightly reclined into the limited available space and had achieved sleep with the impressive speed of someone for whom sleep is not a luxury, but a practiced survival skill. He did not stir when Raymond sat down. To his right, a young mother named Carolyn, 28 years old, traveling alone with an 8-month-old daughter named May, who had begun crying softly somewhere during the safety demonstration and had maintained a steady, earnest, utterly sincere vocalizing since then, not screaming, never screaming, just a consistent, heartfelt expression of opinion about the current state of things that required no translation. Raymond hit the call button within 30 seconds of the seatbelt sign extinguishing. The flight attendant who arrived, a man named Greg, who had been thoroughly briefed by the aircraft's internal communication system about the circumstances of the evening and had arrived at his own quiet, professional conclusions about them, appeared with the pleasant, unhurried demeanor of someone who intends to be exactly as helpful as the situation warrants, and not one increment more. "A double Scotch neat," Raymond said, already fishing for his wallet with the automatic confidence of a man who has ordered this on this airline 100 times and received it without friction every single time. "And a pillow if you have one. This seat isn't reclining properly. The final row has limited recline due to the rear bulkhead," Sir Greg said, with the smooth regret of someone delivering information rather than an apology. "As for the Scotch, that will be $14. I can process a card for you." Raymond's hand stilled in his wallet. "I have Platinum Elite status," he said. "I see here that your current status is Basic Economy, sir," Greg said, tapping his tablet with the particular gentleness of a person who is being kind while also being completely inflexible. "In this cabin, complimentary beverages are water, coffee, or tea. Would you like me to run your card for the Scotch?" Raymond put his credit card on the tray table with a flatness of expression that communicated everything he was not going to say in this particular row surrounded by these particular witnesses. Greg processed the transaction efficiently, handed back the card, delivered the Scotch in a plastic cup with ice that Raymond had not asked for, and moved on down the aisle. May in the next seat had opinions about the ice. Raymond stared at the seat back in front of him with its scratched plastic tray table and its laminated emergency card and its seat pocket that contained, in addition to the safety information, a single chewed pen left by a previous passenger and nothing else, and thought about the contract documents in his briefcase and the signing he was supposed to attend in London in 15 hours and the 11 hours of flight time that remained between him and it. His Scotch was already lukewarm. 3 hours into the flight somewhere over the dark center of the North Atlantic, where the aircraft's altitude was the only fact that distinguished it from the ocean below. Priya sat in seat 5A with her phone face down on her tray table and reviewed what she had captured. She had kept her promise. The video had not been posted. She had watched it back twice in the dimness of the cabin. The white noise of the engines and the soft sounds of 30 sleeping passengers around her, and what struck her watching it was not what she had expected to be the most powerful part. She had expected the power to be in the confrontation in Della's escalating pressure, and Naomi's composure in the arrival of the officers and the dramatic pivot of Captain Reed. All of those things were in the footage, and all of them were striking. But the part that stopped her, the part she rewound and watched a second time, and then a third, was a 12-second sequence she had not consciously composed, in which the frame held Naomi's profile at the window with the JFK tarmac dark and distant behind her, and in the background, slightly soft but unmistakably present, Oliver in seat 6. Watching her with his coloring book in his lap and his pencil forgotten in his hand. A 9-year-old boy watching a woman refuse to be moved, trying to understand why anyone would want her to be. Priya had covered enough stories in her career to know when something true was in a frame. This was true. 3 rows back, A woman named Harriet Silver-haired 64, a retired schoolteacher from New Jersey who had been gripping her phone through most of the confrontation, had not kept any promise because no one had asked her to make one. She had captured a shorter clip from a slightly different angle, 14 seconds, and she had posted it to her social media account with a caption that simply said, "This happened on my flight tonight." The woman in the seat is the COO of the airline. The woman who tried to have her arrested was the flight attendant. The pilot came out to apologize. She had posted it before airplane mode with the uncomplicated conviction of someone who has witnessed an injustice and reached for the most direct tool available to her. The wheels touched at Heathrow Terminal 3 at 7:52 in the morning. London time to a gray sky and light rain and the particular flat light of an English autumn morning that makes everything look both very old and very new simultaneously. Naomi's phone powered back on as the aircraft taxied to the gate received 49 notifications in the first 11 seconds. She looked at the number without reading any of them, set the phone face down on her tray table and gathered her briefcase from the overhead bin with the same unhurried movements she had used for everything else tonight. The battered leather, the worn edges. She had carried this briefcase from the first year of her career, and she intended to keep carrying it. Priya found her in the jet bridge, held out her phone with the screen showing Harriet's post and the view count beneath it, 6 million still climbing, and said, "It's already out there." Naomi looked at the number, looked at the footage, looked at Priya. "Then let's make sure what comes next is worth watching," she said, and walked into the terminal and toward everything that happened after. 1 week later, the 42nd floor of Vanguard Aviation's Chicago headquarters held the kind of morning light that makes even difficult work feel purposeful, full, and clean, and without shadows pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows at a low autumn angle that caught the surface of the conference table and turned the mahogany almost amber. Naomi sat at the head of the table in a tailored navy blazer, her leather notebook open in front of her, her pen parallel to its edge. Around her, the senior vice presidents of human resources, flight operations, legal, and customer relations sat with the particular attentiveness of people who have spent the past 7 days watching their new COO operate and have concluded unanimously, and without needing to discuss it, that they do not want to be unprepared in her presence. The room smelled of fresh coffee and something older. The weight of institutional decisions being made, consequences being formalized, the particular gravity of authority being exercised with full awareness of what it costs. Primary agenda item, Naomi said, opening the meeting without preamble. The consequences of Flight 2219. Let's go through it clearly. Nathan Graves, 5P of Human Resources, set a folder on the table and spoke without unnecessary preamble. The termination of Della Hartwell had been finalized. The union had mounted an initial defense, examined the eyewitness testimonies from 6 first-class passengers, the flight deck logs, the junior crew statements, and the boarding manifest records, and had withdrawn their grievance within 48 hours. The FAA had officially revoked Della's flight attendant certification permanently, citing the deliberate initiation of a false Code 3 security threat as an egregious misuse of federal protocols. A civil penalty of $15,000 had been assessed for the misuse of Port Authority law enforcement resources. Her pension accumulated over 22 years remained intact under federal statute. Naomi listened to this without expression. When Nathan finished, she was quiet for a moment, her eyes moving to the window where a 777 was lifting off from O'Hare's northwest runway, climbing banking, slightly disappearing into the low gray clouds. "She will never work as cabin crew again," Naomi said. It was not a question. "No," Nathan said. "She won't." Naomi looked back at the table. "That is a hard thing," she said quietly, and she meant it, and everyone in the room understood that the meaning of it was not softness, but something more complicated, the willingness to hold the full weight of a consequence even when the consequence is necessary and right. it is also the right thing. When a person uses the mechanisms of safety and security to harm someone they have decided does not belong when they turn those mechanisms into weapons, they have made a choice, and choices have weight. The weight here is proportionate to what was done. She paused. What are we doing to make sure this cannot happen again? The VP of Operations leaned forward. Mandatory implicit bias training, the real and specific kind, for all 14,000 crew members across the transatlantic network, with third-party facilitation and annual recertification. A direct reporting line for junior crew, secure and anonymous bypassing in-flight hierarchy entirely, so that the next Jade, the next person who checks the manifest and knows the truth and has nowhere safe to say it, has somewhere to say it. Good, Naomi said, and made a note. We train people to lead the way Jade led, not the way Della ruled. The VP of Customer Relations delivered the update on Raymond Voss with the careful neutrality of a man reporting facts he finds genuinely satisfying. Elliot Harmon, who had been seated in row 6 across from Oliver throughout the entire sequence, observing with the quiet and comprehensive attention of a CEO who understands that how a person behaves when they think no one important is watching is the most accurate data available about who they actually are, had withdrawn from the contract negotiations before the aircraft had landed at Heathrow. The formal letter cited a fundamental misalignment of values. The deal, valued at $11 million in projected revenue over 3 years, was gone. Raymond's Platinum Elite status had been revoked across all Vanguard carriers and alliance partners for 5 years. He was free to book basic economy when he needed to fly. Naomi listened, looked down at her notebook, and wrote nothing. Some things did not require a note. They simply required acknowledgement. Actions have weight, she said. They always do. We just don't always get to see it in real time. She closed her notebook. Last item, Jade Williams. Nathan Graves allowed himself a small smile. Pulled from the active roster as requested. Relocation package approved. She starts in the Chicago Training Division on Monday. She designed the prototype curriculum herself, the VP of Operations added with something like admiration. Over the weekend, unsolicited. It's better than what our consultants produced. Naomi stood, buttoning her blazer. Then we lead with hers, she said simply. Meeting adjourned. The video reached 47 million views in 72 hours and became the catalyst for a congressional hearing on passenger rights in premium air travel, the first of its kind in 11 years. Within 90 days, 4 additional major carriers announced third-party audits of their own premium cabin service standards, citing Flight 2219 as the specific event that had made the need undeniable. Jade Williams's training curriculum was licensed to 3 of those carriers. The program was called at her quiet insistence and over the objections of the marketing department, who wanted something more corporate, simply, see the passenger. Oliver's father, David, sent a photograph to Naomi's office 6 weeks after the flight. Oliver standing in front of his class at school, holding up his essay about the woman on the airplane who won by sitting still. His teacher had given it an A and asked if it could be read aloud. Oliver had said yes. 6 months after Flight 2219, a plain white envelope arrived at Naomi's Chicago office with a stamp from a town in Ohio she did not recognize. The handwriting on the envelope was careful, the kind of careful that suggests the writer had thought for a while before putting pen to paper. Inside was a single page. No return address. Della Hartwell did not ask for her job back. She did not make excuses. She wrote in 4 paragraphs that were the most honest thing she had produced in 2 decades that she had carried certain beliefs about who belonged in certain spaces for her entire career, and had never once stopped to ask herself where those beliefs had come from or whether they were true. She was asking herself now. It was, she wrote, a harder question than she had expected. Naomi did not write back. But she gave the letter to Jade, and Jade, with Della's name removed, placed it at the beginning of the training program as the first thing every crew member read, not as a cautionary tale, as a mirror. The last aircraft of the day lifted off from O'Hare as the sun went down, and Naomi watched it from her window on the 42nd floor until its lights became indistinguishable from the first stars appearing in the east. She had started her career on the tarmac below in the noise and the heat and the anonymity of work that most people never think about. She had never forgotten what that felt like to be unseen, to be necessary to keep something enormous moving through the air. The sky had not changed. But the airline had one irreversible decision at a time, and there was still a long way to go, and she intended to keep going. If this story moved you, if you believe that every person deserves to be seen for who they are and not judged by how they look, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Because the stories that matter most are the ones we tell together.